Hi, everybody. I'm Soledad O'Brien, and I am a journalist. And we are here to have a conversation today about homelessness. It's a national crisis that has worsened, obviously, amid the coronavirus pandemic, with COVID-19 truly pulling back the cover on how the dearth of affordable housing has left those with the lowest incomes and also the worst health outcomes with the highest housing burden. Now, in New York City alone, there are 50,000 people in the shelter system, and that's a record low because moratoria has actually prevented many families and single adults from being evicted. But that, of course, is a temporary solution. As the city continues to relax restrictions and reopen, those bills are coming due. And a city that has long struggled to create a significant dent in homelessness, then the question surfaces, how do you keep people in their homes? I'm joined by Áine Duggan. She is the CEO for the Partnership for the Homeless, a nonprofit that has truly been on the front lines for nearly 2 decades addressing issues of homelessness. During the pandemic, the organization stepped in to prevent 1,000 people from losing their homes. But once the pandemic ends, of course, the crisis of homelessness is not expected to go away. In fact, it may get considerably worse unless something is done. So Áine, thank you very much for joining me for this conversation. I truly appreciate it.
Oh, thank you. We obviously this conversation is vital for us, and I'm delighted that we have time to spend together on it.
It is my pleasure, truly. So let's begin with the Partnership for Homeless, because I think it's an organization that I certainly have heard of forever. But to walk us through specifically what you do and what the goals are and the strategies are.
So the organization has been around for a very long time, as you mentioned, and it's really worked on all aspects of homelessness over the years. So, working with people who are living on the street, drop-in centers, doing support for shelters and so on. But the primary work, and over the years, the work has very much morphed into working with families, because families are primarily the people who are impacted by homelessness in New York. And I think in recent years, we have become laser focused on prevention because, with the experience that we have, we really have come to the conclusion that this is a very solvable problem because it's a very preventable problem. And in terms of our own work, it's, I suppose there's 4 prongs to it, really. There's a housing piece where we do, crisis work and eviction prevention, rental assistance, landlord mediation, very sort of bricks and mortar work. Then we surround that with what I would describe as emotional health work. It's really trauma informed, working with families who are, sort of suffering the impact of trauma, stabilizing them so they don't cycle in and out of the crises that cause homelessness. And that's primarily counseling, group work, support groups, and that type of thing. And then the third area is education. And that's very much about keeping kids in school. And for kids who go into shelter, making sure they have access to education. And then the fourth prong, well, it's really, I think one of the things that we've realized is if we are to be realistic about solving the problem, we have to first engage people, like engage the public so that they fully understand what homelessness is all about, particularly that piece about it primarily impacts families.
Which means the face of homelessness, I think, is very different than what many people might think. I remember years ago, I pitched doing a documentary on people who were poor and homeless in America. And my boss at the time said, literally, I'm quoting, "Ick, who wants to see that?" Right? And the idea was that homeless people were of this group kind of over there, and they almost like, they ride the rails with a stick and it was so not, they look like us. And if we were all sitting on a subway train, you might not actually know the difference, right? They look like people taking their kid to school. Tell us about the face of homelessness, certainly here in New York City.
Well, it's exactly what you just said. I mean, most mornings and afternoons and evenings, we're all riding the subway together, and nobody knows the difference, so to speak. And that's because, look, for the most part, if I say the word homeless, there's a certain image that comes into everybody's head. And unfortunately, it's the image that sort of gets put out there over and over again, maybe by the media and sort of, sort of popular culture. Street homelessness, as people sort of understand it, really only represents 1 in 10 of people experiencing, less than 1 in 10, in fact, of people experiencing homelessness in New York City. The vast majority of people experiencing homelessness are in the shelter system, and the vast majority of them are in family shelters. So more than 2/3 of the people inside in the shelter system are in the family shelters. And when you begin to narrow the lens a little bit more, you see that if you were really to pick out a face that represents homelessness in New York, it would be that of a child. Tonight there's approximately 50,000 New Yorkers bedding down in the system. 15,000 of them are children. And this has been the case now for many decades, certainly as long as I've been in New York City. This is not a new story by any stretch of the imagination. But I think the other thing that you see in the numbers, and in conversations like this, I often don't like to play a lot on statistics because it can be quite boring for people, But this is one area where the numbers really do help to paint a picture, because, more than 90% of people inside in the shelter system identify as people of color. And more than 90% of families in the family shelter system are headed up by women. So what you really see there is that sort of intersectional piece about systemic racism and sexism that has long been at the heart of housing and housing policy in America, going back over decades and generations. So this is a long-standing problem, and it's not new that families are bearing the brunt of the crisis.
And yet you say very clearly that you think homelessness is solvable. What are the things that have to happen to make sure that we're able to keep people from becoming homeless?
Well, one of the reasons that we say that is because I think we sort of landed in a place in sort of the modern age and in popular culture where there's almost a belief that it's intractable, that there'd be some degree of homelessness always with us. And even those of us who work in the field can be sort of guilty of believing that at times, But the problem with that belief is you then sort of have to ask yourself the question, well, okay, then who is it that's not deserving of a home? For whom is it okay to not have a home? And unfortunately, that leads you back to the piece about, well, it's mostly women of color and children who don't have a home. So are we saying it's okay for women of color and children to not have a safe place to call home? So I think that's really the driver for us, that it's, the answer to that question is clearly no. And so then how can we get to zero? And the barometer should be, let's get to zero. So for us, that's where the prevention answer comes in. We've looked at, well, what are the drivers of homelessness? And in the shelter system in New York, there are 3 main drivers. Domestic violence is one of them. Evictions is another. And then overcrowding is the third. And when you sort of take those apart and you think about the ways to address them, you can begin to see how solvable it is. Because with evictions, well, if there's one silver lining, and there aren't many silver linings in this pandemic, but if there's one silver lining in terms of poverty and homelessness, it's that the eviction moratorium being in place over many months now proves the point that if you prevent evictions, the shelter numbers will come down. Over the last year or so, they have come down by about 10,000 people. So while 50,000 is still a huge number of people in the shelter system, it was obviously much higher. So preventing evictions does keep people in their homes, and making sure that there's rental assistance available for that. People do fall into arrears. Making sure there's assistance available to them so that they can keep their homes is one element of it. And then another element of it is engaging the landlord mediation, making sure legal assistance is available. But that's really only the beginning of prevention. When you look at the domestic violence, gender-based violence, clearly the long-term answer there is making sure that we bring an end to gender-based violence, and working with the many organizations who do that work in the city. But even in the interim, if somebody is faced with a crisis of domestic violence, it shouldn't be the case where they lose their home and then end up in shelter simply because they can't afford to move into a new apartment. They don't have the first month's rent, or they don't have a deposit, right? And that providing assistance, it seems so small, but even providing that level of assistance could help somebody avoid the shelter system altogether. And then I think the bigger piece is the investments in affordable housing. And investments in affordable housing is a prevention measure because it's making sure that we have an appropriate stock of affordable housing in the city. For us, the equation here is really simple. we all know that we live in a city where there are mixed salaries. Not everybody is earning, $1 million salaries in the year. So we need a city where there's people earning from low income to high income. And that being the case, then we need housing that is appropriate to those salaries. I think all of us would be happy to take the $1 million salary if that's the only housing available. But when we want mixed salaries, then we need to have mixed housing as well. So investments in affordable housing is the answer to that. The beauty of all of this is that it's cheaper. It's actually cheaper to invest in prevention than it is to allow homelessness.
I was going to ask you about some of the numbers, right? Because I think one of the questions around any policy shift and change, but I think especially when it comes to dealing with people who are struggling and people who are in poverty is, so what's it going to cost? Can we actually sustain this? Have you seen, is there proof and evidence that, again, prevention on the front end actually saves money on the back end?
Well, what's beautiful about this question about money and the cost of it is that it's obvious even to the kids who are experiencing homelessness, how much cheaper prevention is. So just even taking the average cost of housing for the families that we see is about $1,700 a month in rent. So you're looking at, right, their rent is somewhere in the region of $20,000 a year. The cost of providing shelter for a year to that same family is about $68,000 a year. So more than 3 times the cost of actually helping them to keep their home. And that $68,000 a year cost is falling on the city and the state. So it's actually more expensive for the city and the state to allow homelessness to happen. And that's only the beginning of the cost. Then there's the sort of spiral effect of, what happens when you don't kick in with prevention, and what happens to the family if you allow homelessness to occur. When I look at how much we're paying out in rent arrears, and again, it's about the averages here, right? So the average bill that a family will present with is about $4,000. They've fallen behind in rent. They need about, especially at the moment, right? The numbers have gone up during COVID. So it's about $4,000. The cost of not providing that $4,000 is, okay, so they're now going through the trauma of housing court. They're going through the trauma of going into the shelter. There's the $68,000 a year cost to keep them in shelter. There's the fact that being in shelter usually disrupts work and school, right, for the adults and the kids. And that's huge because people get placed in shelters often far away from their homes. And so you may not be able to attend work because you're trying to take your kids to school and so on, or the kids will miss out on school. Typically, they'll miss out on anywhere between 10 days and a month at the beginning of a shelter stay. And the DOE statistics, as well as the Department of Homeless Services statistics, all show that if a kid falls behind at the beginning, if they miss out on school at the beginning of the shelter stay, they will fall behind indefinitely. Mm. And the numbers, again, the Department of Education numbers bear this out. Less than 50% of kids who go into shelter will end up graduating high school. And so now what we're looking at is the intergenerational cost, because what that essentially means is that that child grows up to be on a fast track to experiencing the kind of poverty that means they'll be at high risk of ending up in the shelter system with their own children. And so it goes, right, from one generation to the next. So the cost of not providing $4,000 in rental assistance is a problem that will stay with us for generation after generation.
And what is the consequence in the macro to not doing anything, right? I mean, not just to those people affected, but to the impact to society overall.
Well, I think what we've seen, if you trace it back over the last few decades, not just in New York, but around the country, is that the numbers of people experiencing homelessness has spiraled out of control. It's become an acceptable part of society. And so you now have entire families growing up from one generation to the next, never having a stable place to call home. That level of instability in society, not only is there a dollar cost to it, but there's a human cost to it, right? And we're not allowing people to reach their full potential simply because we're not providing them with the safety of being able to close a door at night and have somewhere safe to sleep, sort of regather themselves and go back out into the world for the next day. Things that the rest of us take for granted, right? Most of us wouldn't be able to conceptualize how to function in the world if we weren't able to close the door at night and have a safe place to call home, right? Where we can switch off for a few hours and then sort of re-energized to go back into the world. So it's, you're talking about a loss in terms of education, a loss in terms of work, productivity. Like, we're not allowing society to reach its full potential. And the humanitarian cost of the families bearing the brunt of this is astronomical.
Have you found that people in the general public are becoming more sympathetic and understanding that? We finished a documentary that looked at homelessness in Seattle in COVID-19. What happens when you're already vulnerable and there's a crisis? There's a crisis, and you're already in crisis, essentially. And it seems to me that the public has really shifted in how it thinks about, like, I think people understand, oh my gosh, if you're living in your car at a time when all of us are complaining about being stuck in our homes, like, I think I felt that the feedback we got on that doc was that people really genuinely understood how hard that has to be. Have you noticed a change over time in just how the general public thinks about homelessness?
I think what I've noticed, which will be a funny way now to say it, but I've noticed that the political world and the media world is catching up with what the general public thinks. In my experience, and I've been doing this work now for the better part of 25 years, the general public has always been empathetic and compassionate, the vast majority, in terms of understanding this issue. Nothing has borne this out more than COVID itself. I mean, one of the things that is just, beautiful to see, that while families have been suffering through the economic crisis of COVID, and mind you, the families that are bearing the brunt of the economic fallout of COVID also bore the brunt of the health crisis itself. But as we've been doing work and making that information public, the number of private individuals in the city and in the surrounding states who have been donating money to help other families pay rent. And I'm talking about everything from the $10 donor on up to the tens of thousands. It has really been staggering, that level of generosity. And in fact, private individuals have led the way, and the private sector in general has been sort of at the table trying to provide extra money to help people pay rent. The one party that's sort of slow is government itself. And it would be wonderful to see government actually following the trend of the general public when it comes to homelessness and particularly this COVID crisis,
Well, what would it have to take? What would that look like when it, in your mind, when it all comes together? Because I do think people think of it as a very intractable problem because there's all these, as you describe it, right, pieces that have to come together that would keep people in their homes. What does that look like when it's working in the city?
Well, it's largely about priorities and political will, right? So if, sort of the two examples I would give are, if we're taking the COVID crisis and looking at the relief bill recently passed by the federal government, it does include 25 billion in rental assistance for families who are in arrears. Sounds like a very big number until we understand that 25 billion is only a quarter of the need in the country at the moment. So obviously a lot of people are going to be left out. But even at that money is moving incredibly slowly through the infrastructure of the states and the various different jurisdictions. And I think that prioritizing getting that money to families in need is one way in which we can begin to sort of solve the problem, and using the infrastructure of community organizations that already exists in order to roll out the money. So that's one piece. But then the second piece more broadly, like if we look at, like New York is a very good example of this. We're quite fortunate in New York to have a legal right to shelter. And over the last number of decades, it has saved tens of thousands of lives, right? So people don't need to be on the street, they can access shelter. But when the legal right to shelter was put in place by the individuals who fought for that right, they did not see that as the beginning and end of the road. They very much saw it as the beginning of the road. And unfortunately, public policy has not kept pace. It hasn't followed that intent, such that every different sort of administration that comes in has become a manager of the shelter system as opposed to having policy that can end homelessness. We do need the shelter system, but we also need policy that will end homelessness. And that's where it comes back to investing in affordable housing, investing in, mental health, emotional well-being programming to help stabilize people, making sure that kids can stay in school. All investments that would cost less than allowing these families to end up in the shelter system.
Am I allowed to encourage everybody to give money to the Partnership for the Homeless? I think I am. So maybe I'd start there. And because we're close to running out of time, I'd love for you to tell people what they can do, how they can connect with you. What is the way that somebody who's watching this can say, how do I help in some capacity?
So the best way to learn about us is through the website. It's partnershipforthehomeless.org. And then we also have an email address, info@pfth.org. PFDH is the acronym. And anyone can reach us via that email address. We particularly encourage individuals and families who need assistance, who may need rental assistance or any other types of questions answered, to contact us at that address. And then anybody else who wants to learn about the organization, whether it's to donate or to get more information about what the organization does, can also email us, and we're very happy to have that conversation.
Great. Áine Duggan is the CEO of the Partnership for the Homeless. Thank you for talking with me in this conversation. Really learned a lot, and I like how you emphasize the solvability of the problem, because I do think one of the biggest challenges is this sense of like, well, it's to be managed, not to be ended. I think that is a very big problem. For everybody who's watching us, as Áine said, if you want to learn more about the issue, about prevention measures that are pivotal to get that homelessness number down to 0, and about how you can support the Partnership for the Homeless, you can visit the partnershipforthehomeless.org, as Áine said. I'm Soledad O'Brien. Thanks for listening to our special report on preventing homelessness in New York City. Áine, thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Soledad.
Pleasure.